Good evening. Welcome to MUFON Los Angeles. My name is Steve Murillo, and I am the State Section Director for MUFON LA. Tonight, all the way from Great Britain, all the way from England, we brought this gentleman, Richard Lawrence. He is a world-renowned UFO expert and spiritual teacher. Richard Lawrence was among the first to bring declassified CIA and Pentagon UFO files to Britain in 1979. He's Executive Secretary of the Etheria Society in Europe and is one of the most respected names in the body, mind, and spirit movement, appearing frequently on TV and radio. He's a workshop leader and speaker. Richard has lectured in the USA, New Zealand, Australia, Africa, and Europe. His books include Prayer Energy, Unlock Your Psychic Powers, and the award-winning Gods, Guides, and Guardian Angels. He was a leading disciple and close friend of contactee Dr. George King, and whom he co-authored Contacts with the Gods from Space and Realize Your Inner Potential. All the way from Britain, would you please give a warm welcome, put your hands together for Richard Lawrence.
Thank you very much indeed. I must say it's really great to be here, and I do want to thank MUFON for inviting me to come here tonight. I want to talk to you about a book, UFOs and the Extraterrestrial Message, which has just been published in America, and the basis for that. The kind of approach that I adopt and that I wish to speak to you about tonight is very much the spiritual approach to this topic. And I know that's not everybody's cup of tea, but on the other hand, I think there's a big change. I've noticed certainly in the UK a very big change in that there used to be, if you like, two very distinctive camps, really. One was what they used to call the nuts and bolts ufologist camp, and the other was the more spiritual, metaphysical, mystical approach to the subject, and never the twain shall meet. And that has changed, which is great. I think people are starting to recognize that there are different aspects which need to be represented in this field, and we're dealing here with such an enormous topic, aren't we? I mean, the implications of this are the greatest implications that any issue presents, I think, because after all, if UFOs exist, and I think possibly most of us believe they do, and that they are manned and they're intelligently controlled, then all the problems of the world are affected by this, and I believe can be solved by this, if we take the correct approach. And I think one of the first things one starts to realize about UFOs is that it's not new. It's a very, very ancient topic. It's not something that just sort of got invented after the Second World War. It goes right back into the earliest records on Earth, and I think you probably, I imagine, cover this from time to time. MUFON, of course, is known the world over for the research that's done into this subject. And I'm talking here, and again, this is where I think the spiritual connection comes in, because the sources, the records for this ancient phenomenon, which represents a very subtle plan. I mean, if UFOs, as I believe they have, and I'm sure many share this belief here, have been watching over us, have been observing us for not 50 years or 100 years, but thousands of years, what is the plan? And this is where it gets, I think, really interesting. Who are they? Why are they here? I was quoted in a journal in the UK called Time Out, and it's probably slightly disrespectful, but saying that just spotting UFOs can become almost like a cosmic form of train spotting in a way, because what really matters isn't just the objects themselves, beautiful as though those can be, and wonderful those experiences can be, and I've had them myself, but who is on them? Who is manning them? Why are they here? And that's what I'm attempting to explore in UFOs and the Extraterrestrial Message. So the earliest records on Earth, the Hindu scripts among them, give fantastic descriptions, don't they, of extraterrestrial spacecraft. They have the word Vimana, the Sanskrit word, which literally means flying celestial vehicle. You know, we have had some very unacceptable descriptions, really, or very, perhaps not unacceptable, but very mundane and pedestrian phrases. I mean, flying saucer. Is that the best we can come up with? You know, a piece of crockery. I mean, I actually found in researching for this book, and I was helped in the research, in an old Japanese 11th century record, there was mention of one of these sightings, and the terms used were the term for a flying earthenware vessel. So obviously this is not completely new to the 20th century, but really the Hindu scripts have some beautiful depictions. And I give examples in the book of these. In fact, I'll just give you one little example of a very beautiful description, if I can find it quickly here, from the Hindu scripts. Here we have, this is from the Mahabharata, and this is thousands of years ago. No one really knows, do they, how old the Hindu scripts are. Some scholars say 5,000 years, but there are those who believe they were handed down verbally for hundreds of thousands of years before that. These are very ancient writings. And here's one extract. Causing the heaven and the earth to be filled by a loud sound, then Indra came to Yudhishthira on a vimana and asked him to ascend it. Seeing his brothers fallen on the earth, King Yudhishthira the just said to the deity of 1,000 eyes these words, my brothers have all dropped down here. They must go with me. Without them by me, I do not wish to go to the celestial region, O Lord of all the celestials. And so it goes on. And just giving you the last paragraph of this, then Dharma and Indra and the other deities, causing Yudhishthira to ascend on a vimana, went to the celestial region, those beings crowned with success and capable of going everywhere at will, rode their respective vimanas. King Yudhishthira, riding on his vimana, ascended quickly, causing the entire sky to blaze with his effulgence. I mean, that beats many UFO sightings and descriptions. And I think some of us who've seen UFOs have had a sighting of a blaze of light. I've certainly had that myself in the UK and Wales, and having been in this field for some time, one does get very cautious. I don't know if you found that. One is very skeptical. One's saying, could this be a meteorite? Could this be a satellite? Could it be a terrestrial aircraft? And I remember my wife Alison and I were walking out in Wales, and 3 objects flew above us together in a kind of formation and then stopped. They moved very fast and they stopped. And ridiculously, I said, well, maybe these are satellites, which of course they don't go in 3s. This is how skeptical you can get, and I'm a believer. And as soon as I said that, it illuminated the whole sky and shot off at 90 degrees, all 3 of them. So there was a blaze of effulgence, if you like. But these descriptions of vimanas are beautiful, and they describe how gods like Rama and others travelled in these, and they describe a spirituality behind the conduct of these gods connected with UFOs. And this, I think, is very significant. And of course, if we look to the West, if we look to the Bible, the Holy Bible, I mean, that is one fantastic UFO source, the Bible. You know, I don't know whether all vicars and priests would agree with that, but one man actually from this area who would have agreed with that was a man called Dr. Frank Stranges from California, who was an evangelical preacher, and some of you may have seen him speak, I certainly have, who absolutely tied the Bible together with UFOs. But I mean, it is full of UFOs. I mean, let's take the most obvious, the most famous case of all. A star cannot hover over a stable, can it? I mean, if a star hovered over a stable, a town, a planet, that being a sun, of course, the planet would be destroyed by that star. Clearly, there you have, if you believe the account, 3 men who were guided to a particular place for a particular reason by an object. And it wasn't even unidentified. It was an IFO. It was an identified flying object. And these three men were told were very wise. And indeed they were, I'm sure. And this took them to this great event, the birth of what I believe was a cosmic being. But more of that later. But it's not just the New Testament. I mean, there's lots of clouds in the Bible that behave very strangely. Have you noticed that? The very strange behavior, these clouds in the Bible. And we have to think back, don't we, to a time when they weren't familiar with space travel. I mean, we know about space travel now. Then they were looking at objects, and they were looking at beings coming out of them, and these objects looked rather like clouds. I mean, sometimes they can. I had what they used to call a cigar-shaped sighting. Now they generally say oblong. A long time ago when I was at university, and it was like an illuminated cloud, except that it didn't change shape. It was fixed in its shape, moving slowly. And yes, indeed, they could be described as being like clouds, but clouds do not take Moses up Mount Sinai with 2 tablets of stone, as this particular cloud is described as doing in the Old Testament. And you can see many examples throughout the Bible, of course. And again, I'm coming back to my theme here. Here we have a spiritual connection. And Buddhism is, and I was helped in the book by a Buddhist researcher actually, is very interesting, because Buddhism, not only is there mention of objects, but more, they had a concept, and still do have a concept, of the universe being populated by heavenly beings throughout the universe, throughout what they call the lokas, L-O-K-A-S. And those lokas are heavenly spheres. And this, I think, is particularly significant when you think of where science is now moving. And I think this is one of the, I have found, I was speaking earlier this year at a major UFO conference in England called Exopolitics, which is held in the north of England. And at one time, the kind of spiritual message that I was giving would not have gone down too well. Now, there was tremendous open-mindedness, and I think one of the reasons there's a big change is that science is discovering so much. There are scientists who, really against their will, some, and I don't mean all by any means, but there's a sort of select group of them, who are really being driven towards spiritual concepts, whether they like it or not. I mean, when you say that only 4% of the mass of the universe is visible and detectable, 96% is dark matter or dark energy, is invisible matter, you are entering there the area of metaphysics, aren't you, just by that concept. I mean, that's a thing that some of the psychic researchers of 100 years ago wouldn't have dreamt of saying, really. And yet that's where science is being forced. I was helped by a researcher who has just written a book called Countdown to Coherence about the new science and how it's moving in a spiritual direction. And she was interviewing scientists all over the world who are cutting-edge scientists. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying this is the mainstream of orthodox science. But there are a number of scientists working in universities, especially in America, actually, who are not necessarily appreciated by all their colleagues, but are touching on areas. And one of them is the examination of the electromagnetic spectrum. And it's interesting there too that an image was given actually, which is this, that if the whole of the electromagnetic spectrum, which includes all waves, radio waves, gamma waves, every kind of ultraviolet, infrared, everything, as well as the visible light spectrum, if all of that was 2,500 miles in length, if you sort of likened it to a distance, then the amount of that 2,500 miles that would actually be visible to us would be 2 inches. And so this is a whole area that some scientists are saying is revealing life, and they're looking at what the Buddhists call lokas, higher frequencies of dimensional existence. And of course, string theory is 11 dimensions, they say now. So all these concepts that are coming in, and I'm not a scientist, I'm not claiming to be at all, I've just given a few pointers in my book as to where some scientists are going in their researches, are leading to a sort of metaphysical concept of the universe. Parallel universes, speeds faster than light. I mean, Stephen Hawking has changed his mind on time travel now, and people are seriously postulating that you could leave one destination before, or rather after, you arrive at where you're going. And concepts like this are coming into theoretical physics and being taken very, very seriously. And this is forcing people again, I believe, to look at a spiritual connection. But let me just reel back a little bit, if I may. So this is not a new phenomenon. This is an ancient phenomenon. But I do believe, and in the Aetherius Society we do believe, that this particular period of history is one of the most significant we've ever faced. And in fact, you can see it, really. I mean, just to name one thing, we have the capacity to destroy the planet now. And that alone changes everything. And it is not surprising, is it, really, that extraterrestrial beings would take an even closer and more hands-on interest than ever before, because not only are we affected by this, but so is the universe, so is the solar system, at least, directly affected by the presence of the kind of weaponry we now have on this planet and the threat that it poses to this planet and beyond. I'll answer that phone in a minute. Don't know who that is. Oh, thank you. That was it. But the higher levels, the higher planes of existence are, I believe, key to understanding this phenomenon. And this is where there's a great tie-in with a lot of metaphysical and mystical thinking, such as alchemy, for example, and things like that. So this is a key time, and it's not therefore surprising there were a number of key and very significant contacts made in the 20th century. And I'll just name one or two. I mean, there are many, and there'll be people here who'll know more about some of these than I do. I researched in certain cases, well known. Some of them have been discredited, but that doesn't mean they're untrue. There are, as I think we all know, attempts to discredit things. And those attempts may succeed, but doesn't mean they're true. And of course, some people have been vindicated later. One of those, of course, would be George Adamski, somebody not too far from here, who had contacts, didn't he, in the early 50s. Another would be Dan Fry, gentleman I actually met late in his life, not very far from here, who had a contact in the very early 1950s. These were significant contacts. Both those gentlemen, Adamski and Dan Fry, in their first contacts, physical contacts, round about I think Adamski was 52, and I think Dan Fry is variously reported as 50 or 51. Both of them said that these contacts contain spiritual information. Dan Fry said he was taken in a UFO from one part of America to another at great speed, but on the journey he was told about Lemuria, Atlantis, ancient civilizations, things which he had no knowledge of at that time in particular. And Adamski, who did have a metaphysical interest, also was given a very spiritual message. And I know there are those who say that UFOs are hostile, and I know there are reports of hostile events made, and I'm not saying that they're all untrue or anything like that, but as far as I'm concerned, they may not be what people attribute them to be, because in this day and age, there is a tendency to attribute everything to aliens. So people who are having paranormal experiences, which have gone on for hundreds of years, thousands of years, people tend to think, this must be an alien. Whereas, say, 400 years ago in England, they might have thought it was a ghost. Or 800 years ago, they might have thought it was a hobgoblin, or the devil himself, or what have you. And so we have to discriminate, I think, very carefully, which is not to say that people aren't having these experiences. But frankly, in the Ethereal Society, we are very clear that if alien beings were hostile, we wouldn't be wondering about it. We would know beyond any doubt. We would present no threat whatsoever to a hostile invading alien race. I'm afraid, contrary to Independence Day, it wouldn't be a case of the President of America flying up in an airplane to defend us, or whatever it was. We just wouldn't. These intelligences can get here for a start. Barring present company and some researchers and so forth, the world hasn't really addressed this issue properly. So we would be completely unprepared if they were hostile. But what they certainly are, and I want to come back to this, is very subtle. They have a very subtle plan. And it's a long-term plan, and this is where it gets really interesting. I came across an interview not so long ago with a spokesman from the United Nations on the BBC in England, who was interviewed and asked what would happen if aliens contacted us. And the reply this spokesperson gave was, well, it would be, first of all, it would take us a long time to respond because it hasn't yet been decided what language we would respond in, which country would make the response, and what that response would be. And this spokesman reckoned it would take us 6 months to reply. This is what we're dealing with here. And it's not surprising, is it, that they work very carefully, not to mention the fact that they have been treated with hostility. I mean, one of the cases Steve mentioned that I was involved in, some of you may be familiar with it, and it's reproduced in full in this book, was a CIA paper. And again, when I'm looking at government papers and so on, I'm looking for the spiritual message or what it tells us about these beings. Because, the idea, when I first used to speak on this in England in the 1980s, you went on the platform, I don't know what your experience was, any of you who were around speaking about this then, and you said that the governments are lying and they're covering up. You were treated as a bit of a nutter. Or I was treated as a bit of a nutter, a conspiracy nutter. Of course governments don't lie. Well, that would be ridiculous. If I went on a platform now and I said, look, governments are telling you the truth, they'd say I was a complete nutter, wouldn't they? Things have changed, so it's no news now. I mean, everybody accepts there are government cover-ups. We know there are government cover-ups, but I must say that the gentleman I'm going to speak about this evening, Dr. George King, founder president of the Ethereal Society, who I was privileged to work with, and Steve mentioned him in the introduction, he launched a campaign to the government in the streets of London in 1958, never mind the 80s. And London in the 50s was a very conservative, with a small c, place indeed. I mean, you used to, not that I was there, folks, but you used to, have to put a tie on and a jacket to go and post a letter, I think. Everybody was very conservative and very careful. And for somebody to come out in the 1950s, in 1958, in a place called Trafalgar Square, which is a main centre, and campaign for governments to reveal the truth about flying saucers, was extremely controversial. And he was pilloried for it. He was attacked for it. And he stood his ground. And he was a valiant proponent of the fact that governments are not telling us the truth. Now we all know that. But in this particular document I was going to mention that I brought over, which was from here, CIA document, but which was brought to the UK in 1979. I was in touch with someone at the Washington Post at the time, and they got it to me. This is a very interesting little account, I feel. It tells us a lot about these, I'm going to say, wonderful beings from other worlds. there was a UFO sighted over Tehran in 1976. Now, this is a CIA document, so this isn't like a science fiction report or even a second-hand report. This was written down and filed and everything. And this UFO was seen, and I'm cutting the whole story quite briefly here, but to give you the main points. And a jet was buzzed to chase it. Much good may it do them. But that was the thing. And the report, this is the interesting thing. According to the pilot, when they got within range for firing a missile, and they were going to fire a missile at this UFO, according to this report, when they were in range at that exact instant, the weapons control panel went dead. When the UFO moved forward, out of range, the weapons control panel was activated again. And then the UFO just dropped down, did a few more movements and moved away. I mean, I think that it just makes us look so stupid, apart from anything else. It reminds me of, a great giant of a man, say, being hit by a little child, and just gently lifting the child away and going, no, you don't need to do that. No retaliation by this craft, no hostility from this craft, but we try to fire at it. And we wonder why they're rather careful about how they approach us. Not that they need to worry, but they're more concerned about our reactions. And they are, I believe, great psychologists, apart from anything else, too. They're also governed by a thing called karma, which I'm going to come on to, I believe. Another interesting, I'll just give you a couple of examples of government documents. Again, for what they tell us about these beings. This is one you may have come across, and it's one that I brought over to the UK again, and I'm sure it's come over here. This should have been, actually, front page news across the world, I think. And it concerns a landing in a place called Voronezh, which was about 600 or 800 miles from Moscow. Now, this was in 1989, and it was a time when President Gorbachev was president, and he was trying to practice glasnost. You remember openness. He was trying to reveal things. There was a conference going on, I think, between him and I think it'd probably be George Bush Sr. at the time. And it was a negotiation going on to reduce nuclear weapons, and the agency reporting it, you may remember this name, was TASS. And TASS was revealing quite a lot because they were trying to practice something new in the Soviet Union, which was openness. Then they came across this and one or two other amazing UFO experiences, and they decided to practice glasnost, and boy, were they disappointed by the West. Because I was on the phone to someone in Moscow about it at the time. They revealed some of these cases to the media in Europe, in America, and they got scant response, and they were ridiculed by the same organizations that were hanging on their every word when it came to the Reykjavik summit. This is what actually happened. An object landed in a park in Voronezh. A being came out of the object. Tall being, and there was a robot figure, and a crowd observed this. And a boy in the crowd started to cry, and the tall being pointed what appeared to be something like a gun at the boy, and the boy then disappeared. Then pointed it again, the boy reappeared, walked back into the craft moved off, the boy then was fine, by the way, not crying anymore. The craft moved off, leaving indentations in the ground. That was the report. Again, a very interesting demonstration. The boy was helped, and also it was a demonstration of a control over matter that they obviously have and we don't. And this should have been, as I say, this was a serious report coming from TASS, and if you haven't heard of it till now, maybe you have, but if you haven't, that's because the media, you don't need actually a cover-up with some people in the media. I mean, it was explained to me, and I do quite a lot with the media in the UK, and have worked for some of the papers or written in them, and it's been explained to me, look, we're not here to tell people the truth. We're here to tell people the truth they want to hear. And there's a big difference. And that's what has happened, and I think we all know that. But getting back to some of these early contacts, I mentioned George Adamski and Dan Fry. I've already mentioned Frank Stranges, who also claimed a contact. But in England there was a man called Sir Peter Horsley, and I spoke to him myself. Now, this man was, and this is going to sound very strange, I think, to an American audience, but he was the equerry to the Duke of Edinburgh. And we have some very strange job specs in England. We have people like the Blue Mantle Pursuivant and the Rouge Cross and all sorts of people. One of my favourites is the Black Stick. There's a man called the Black Stick, who's actually a very senior general, but he has to walk backwards in the ceremony because that's just been done for hundreds of years in England. It's very charming, I think, but it's certainly something a bit different. Now, this gentleman, though, was equerry to Prince Philip, which was an important rank. I mean, the husband of the Queen, of course. And Prince Philip had quite an interest in UFOs. And one of the things he asked his equerry to do, which if you might say is like a very senior ADC, was to get him data about UFOs so that he could keep abreast of flying, as mainly called flying saucers then. Which he did. And then in 1954, he had a contact with a being, he says, called Mr. Janus, who he believes was an alien. Now, the interesting thing, he was a serious man. He reported this to some of his seniors in the Ministry of Defense and in the Army. He never told Prince Philip about this. It sort of disappeared off the radar, and he kept it quiet until 1997 when he retired. In the meantime, he'd been knighted by the Queen. He was an air marshal. He was number 2 in the air ministry. He's one of the people who had his finger on the nuclear button. I'm saying this so you can see he's a very serious person. And yet he had this encounter which changed his life forever. It's just a shame he didn't reveal it sooner, but eventually he did. And I can illustrate to you, because I'm coming back to my theme here, the spiritual connection with this encounter as well. And this is what he, Sir Peter Horsley, said about Mr. Janus, the contact he had in London in 1954. He said this: "He talked of life throughout the universe, much of it more advanced than our own, and asserted that the humanoid form was not peculiar to the human race. He spoke of races who had overcome the urge to kill and fight wars, and had instead come to love all life, especially humanoid life. They had developed the power of will and advanced sufficiently to be able to dispense with their physical bodies altogether. They were capable of integrating into the one great universal intelligence which seems to be akin to the Buddhist concept of nirvana. He spoke of the Creator and the importance of prayer and collective willpower as the essential links to this source. Significantly, he said that these views do not contradict any of the great religious books, and that there are many different paths to the same destination. The spiritual approach," he said, "is the valid, motivating principle behind space travel." And there's a real establishment figure. You can imagine, over here, somebody who's spent their life in the White House, or perhaps you don't want to imagine someone who's spent their life in the White House, but, someone really from that era, and this is how he described it. And he told me actually on the phone that he'd never ever looked at life the same since he'd had that contact. But he didn't reveal it until his career was finished. So that was a career move on his part. And it's regrettable, I think, but it's good that he revealed it in the end. But there was another man in the same town of London who had a contact in the same year who did reveal it, and that was Dr. George King, who's the man that I'd like to talk to you and maybe introduce some of you to by talking to you about him tonight. He was a very different person. He was a person who'd come up through spiritual interests. He was practicing advanced forms of yoga, which is something that I'm personally very interested in, and in the Aetherius Society we're very interested in, the deeper aspects of yoga. And nowadays, of course, if you say yoga, most people think of just physical exercises, keep fit, tone your body, or what have you. But it's a great and ancient and wonderful philosophy, and he'd been practicing this for 8 hours a day for 10 years. So it wasn't a haphazard choice, as well as doing a job. He's a very unusual individual, a totally focused individual who had his goals set on finding spiritual truth and service to others when he had this contact in London, and he was contacted by an intelligence from another planet in this solar system, namely the planet Venus, called the Master Aetherius. And when I say life on Venus, or life on Mars, or life on Jupiter, I'm not necessarily talking about physical life as we know it, of course. I'm talking about the higher dimensional life. I did a radio interview not very long ago with a man in England who's the Astronomer Royal, and he's called Lord Martin Rees, and I thought this is going to be difficult. This is going to be a difficult interview, because he's going to really have a go at me and come from an orthodox scientific standpoint. On the contrary, I was staggered. He said in this interview, we must open up our minds to life on planets that we think are uninhabitable, like Mars, like Venus, like Jupiter, like Saturn. There is an amazing shift going on. But Dr. King was talking about this way back in the 1950s. So he had this contact, he had this what we now call the command to prepare himself to become the voice of interplanetary parliament, or an interplanetary confederation, you might say. And he did this, and he did it valiantly, and I think people, whether they believe him or disbelieve him or whatever their views of Dr. King, those who have looked into him will say he was a man of total integrity and total commitment. And having known him, and there are others in this audience who knew him and worked closely with him, they will bear that out. Even up to his last days, when he was at all well, he was still completely focused on his mission, which was to cooperate with beings from other worlds. Now, I realize you could say, well, anyone can say that. Why should I believe it? And I would say that you shouldn't believe it just because I say it, of course. I would say it's worth investigating, and that the way to investigate is to look at the caliber of the communications that were received. I mean, there are a lot of people out there claiming, aren't there, to channel alien beings. And you can look at the caliber of the content. I remember one person I met said, look, I'm channeling. I said, okay, what sort of information do you get? I said, mainly agricultural. He said, mainly agriculture. What sort of agriculture? Oh, well, it's not an agriculture we understand. So it wasn't very helpful. The communications channeled through Dr. King are completely practical and completely helpful, and I strongly recommend you to look into them. But let me give you just a couple of examples of some evidence, if you like, for this claim of Dr. King. So there he was in 1954. He was chosen because of his great spirituality, and because he was in a position after that kind of yoga discipline. And it's one of my personal favorite topics, the topic of yoga practice, the higher aspects of yoga. And I haven't come across anybody in the West, I'm not saying there isn't anyone, but I haven't come across anyone in the West who even claims to have practiced advanced form of yoga, if you know about yoga, Raja Yoga, Jnana Yoga, Kundalini Yoga, for 8 hours a day for 10 years. That's an unusual claim in itself. And that's really made him able to channel, to gain rapport, and this isn't a lecture on channeling, which is a very interesting subject, but it's necessary for a genuine channeler. And I'm going to freely admit here that I don't believe all the claims that are out there myself. Hence, I'm not expecting you to take my word for this claim. I'm just inviting you to investigate it. But it's necessary for that channeler to gain a rapport themselves, to raise their consciousness to the level of the being who's communicating with them. And in this case, Dr. King was dealing with very advanced, extremely spiritual beings who had the welfare of the human race in their hearts. People say, well, why should aliens bother with us? And there isn't a very good reason I can think of other than compassion. That's why they're interested. It's also an interesting study in what not to do. The history of this planet. I mean, that we have strange things here, don't we? Like war, if you can call them strange. And this is a very hostile, extremely backward race here. I think that's clear. The distribution of wealth it isn't anywhere near compassion. But anyway, coming back to Dr. King, I was going to give you a couple of examples which I was personally involved in, and they both, again, center, interestingly, on the Soviet Union again. The first one was now, when he received the message, I'm going to play you, if you're interested, later on an extract, so you'll hear how these transmissions sounded. I mean, when he was channeling, he was taken, his larynx was used, you can hear it. Every communicator over decades is consistent in their way they speak, their own distinctive energy, if you like, or quality, and the type of messages vary quite considerably. But one message that Dr. King received was in 1958, and he received details of an atomic accident that occurred in the Soviet Union. Now, this accident was not reported or available anywhere. And it was published, this account, and it gave a broad outline of the numbers injured and the numbers killed. I think it was down to hundreds were killed and thousands were injured. And it was published in a journal which we still publish to this day called Cosmic Voice. And so it's provable, it's there. It was registered with the British Museum Library and so on. And completely dismissed by everybody, this nutter UFO. And it was actually, Dr. King would quite often send some of these messages to members of parliament, embassies, and so on. You can imagine what they made of this. But it doesn't make it untrue. I think, I think, and I'm taking it, and I'm sure this is an audience with an open mind, and that's really all I'm asking. Just because it sounds strange, I think that's one thing we know, it doesn't make it untrue. And one of the things Dr. King received a lot of was information about the dangers of atomic experimentation, and he would share, especially then when they weren't known or accepted anyway. So this accident was recorded, it was registered and reported in Cosmic Voice, and it was denied, and it was just regarded as a wrong story. And then 18 years later, in a very established journal in the UK called The New Scientist, it was reported that indeed this accident had occurred, and the figures were very close to the figures that Dr. King had published and given, only he claimed he received it from an interplanetary being. And I was then, this was 1976, just out of university, very keen, and I was sort of completely ignorant, really, of the media. But for some reason, I was press officer of the Ethereal Society in London. I was a school teacher, but in my spare time, I was press officer. So this came along, and it was a clear-cut proof, I thought. It was an exiled Soviet scientist called Dr. Zorez Medvedev who'd revealed this and was in London lecturing. So I took this information along to the BBC. Now, this is going to sound a bit strange, and I can only tell you it exactly as it happened. And I spoke to a journalist there, and he showed great interest and said, yes, but you know, if you can actually get these facts and these figures corroborated by Dr. Medvedev, you have proved your society, the Ethereal Society, to be correct. That was his words to me. And me, in my innocence, I thought, great, okay, that sounds fantastic. So off I go, and I found where Dr. Medvedev was lecturing in a university. I interviewed him. I didn't actually tell him the whole background, but I did get him to corroborate the facts on tape. I took it back to the BBC. They had actually recorded an interview with me, but they said they'll hold the interview until I come back with these corroborated facts. So I came back with them, and they, I said, here I am, I've come to see, and I unfortunately, I hadn't made a note of this person's name now, I couldn't tell you, but I knew it then, and I said, I've come to see such and such a person, he's waiting to see me, I've got the information he wants. And they said to me, who? I said, such and such a person. They said, oh no, no one of that name works here. And this, I know it sounds strange, but it's absolutely true. And I said, well, I did an interview with him a few hours ago. You've got it on tape in there. I went into this studio and we did it. They said, well, no, I'm sorry, no, we have no record of that. Maybe he was a part-time worker, they said, on a shift, and he's gone now. And that was the end of that, and it never went out. So I can only tell you as it happened, but I didn't give up. I carried on badgering on with the New Scientist. They didn't like it, the New Scientist, but I did tell them, I'm sorry, we can prove, because they had claimed in the New Scientist on their front page that this was a scoop, that they were the first journal ever to report this accident. And eventually, in 1978, on April the 27th, if you want to look it up, in a tiny little paragraph, they did admit, and I'll never forget the headline, "Scooped by a UFO." But it's such a small paragraph that you could easily miss it. So that was one little case, and I was starting to realize then the way of the media. But there's another, I think, even more significant case, which came along later, and this time I was physically with Dr. King in Arizona when he received a communication from a cosmic master. Now, in this case, he didn't channel it through his mouth. He used two methods. One is to channel, in the way I'm going to play you an extract later, and the other was to get what was called a mental transmission, where he would receive it telepathically and write it down. And he received details of a dire catastrophe that was due to occur. He wasn't told, in this case, exactly the details, but he was told something more important, that the Ethereal Society needed to cooperate to alleviate this accident which was due, and to reduce the impact of it. That wasn't the exact phrasing. I haven't got the text in front of me, but that was the spirit of it. And so we engaged in a program of radiating positive spiritual energy out to the world using various apparatus in cooperation with beings from other planets. Now, that I know you could say, what on earth's that all about? Just hold that thought for a moment, because this turned out to be, I think it was 5.5 hours or something like that. Or no, I think it was 4 hours and 50-something minutes before the Chernobyl disaster. And we were carrying on with this program for several days before the world knew. It was several days before the world discovered that Chernobyl had happened. And when they did discover it was happened, it was described, I think, by Greenpeace as a miracle, that it wasn't far, far worse than it actually was, because it was a steam explosion rather than a nuclear explosion. And we published in that year, again in Cosmic Voice, in 1986, a full report of the fact that UFO had reduced the impact, and we cooperated with them, of Chernobyl. And that was the end of that. And it's just like what people might say, there's a wild claim, and it was unsubstantiated, they could say, and so forth. 16 years later, in 2002, the Russian journal Pravda revealed the fact that over the Chernobyl power plant that had blown, a UFO had hovered in 1986 and had been seen by a large crowd, and it had emitted a crimson beam and had reduced the impact of the Chernobyl disaster, I think they said, by fourfold. You may have come across that story now, but it hadn't come out then. So there's just another little example. But of all the various messages that Dr. King received, some of them, I must say, are absolutely beautiful. I'd like to just give you a couple of examples before I play you an extract of the type of message that Dr. King was getting even in the early years when he received communications. Here, for example, is one. And he used to go and channel or enter what was called trance mediumship in those days before a public audience in Big Hall in London. Hundreds of people could be there. He would make predictions of when flying saucers would be operating. And these might be in Australia. One thing I've noticed, and I don't know whether others here have, is that every step we take towards extraterrestrial beings, they take two towards us. I have noticed that on many occasions. I'll never forget when the book Contacts with the Gods from Space came out in the UK, and this turned out to be the last book that Dr. King published. I was privileged to help him, but it was his book. It's his book. I was just lucky to be involved in helping to write it. And it was published, and in this last year of Dr. King's life, we arranged a tour of 22 cities in the UK with this book. And we started in a city called Leicester, and we ended in the south of England in a city called Torquay in Devon. And I'll never forget that on that first lecture in Leicester, there was a massive UFO sighting 2 hours before the lecture, seen by people who didn't even know there was a lecture in Leicester that night on UFOs. And on we go, and then I arrived at the last city, which was Torquay in Devon, and the front page of their local paper said, UFO seen heading for Torquay, on the day I arrived. And it is interesting, there's been many cases, I know it sounds fanciful, and there may be others who bear me out here, of direct response, cooperation, when you work with these great intelligences. Now, here was a communication received in 1956 by Dr. King, and this one was received from a being from Mars by the name of Mars Sector 6. And this is the message that was received. And I must thank the international directors of the Etheria Society who gave permission for these extracts to be reproduced in this book. In fact, some of them have never been reproduced anywhere before, some of these extracts. And that's a really wonderful thing. And I was greatly helped, may I say, in this by my colleague, who's the executive secretary here, Brian Kneep, who's there at the back. And you can see him there if you just raise your hand, Brian. And Brian actually was the person who selected these extracts for this book. And thank you for that, Brian. So here's just an example to give you a flavour of the quality of these communications. Subject, a sign. Many brothers of Earth have requested from us a sign. Many signs have been given by people from other planets, signs which should have proved to thinking terrestrial men beyond any doubt that we do exist, that we are indeed living entities, that we have indeed the interest of Earth at heart. As numerous though as these signs have been, they still do not satisfy certain terrestrial intelligences. I ask my brothers from Earth who require as a sign a landing of one of our craft in a prominent position to give us a sign. I think this is really, this is a comment I'd like to make, coming back to the point I made earlier about karma. You know, what goes around comes around. To every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. They are governed by karma. People say, what, if they exist then, why don't they land openly? Why don't they prove themselves to everybody now? Why don't they come and help us directly and so forth and so on? They actually help us far more than we know. But frankly, there's psychological reasons for a start, but there are also reasons of karma. You know, the best example I could give of this, particularly those of you who are parents. I'm not a parent, but I was a school teacher. And if you did your children's homework for them every night, I was going to say they might get very good results. Maybe they wouldn't. I don't know whether you'd be better or not. But, you know, probably they'd get very good results, but they'd learn nothing. And this is understood by beings from other planets. We have certain lessons to learn. They will do all they can. They will intervene as far as they can, but they can go so far and no further. Let me read on. Science has requested a sign from flying saucers. I ask science to give us their sign. What sign do we require? Their goodwill, their complete open-minded honesty, and their proof that if we reveal to them the secrets of the vibrations of crystals, these secrets will be used for the benefit of all. We cannot reveal our science to the scientists of Earth until they prove to us their godliness. We would only be instrumental in taking Earth back another 70 decades if we gave the secrets of our gravitational control to you now. Would it benefit you? Not so. Would it benefit the ordinary man? It would not. It would be used for belligerent purposes, a belligerence which would be covered by the camouflage of defense. Then science know this: when you give unto us a sign, then we will give unto you a sign, the sign which you now require. This will be accepted as the measure of your goodwill. That was the kind of caliber of communication. Talking of defense, in England, UFO sightings, as you may know, were all logged at our Ministry of Defence, or those who reported them. That's the department. And the Ministry of Defence for years and years in the UK used to deny having any UFO files. Eventually it was revealed actually in the House of Lords, in Parliament, that they do have these files. They've never been really properly released until quite recently. And so quite recently, in the last we haven't had a Freedom of Information Act very long, unlike you. And of course we didn't have, Watergate. But having said that, the Freedom of Information Act in the UK, you might be interested to know, is quite wide-ranging. You can ask questions about a whole variety of things. And the three most commonly asked questions under the Freedom of Information Act in the UK, the top three questions all apply to UFOs. So the idea that the public isn't interested it is nonsense. And the idea that nobody believes in them is nonsense now. People do. People are open-minded, and some people want to know the answers. So they were so inundated, the Ministry of Defence, with questions under the Freedom of Information Act and demand for files to come out, that lo and behold, what did they do about a year ago? The Ministry of Defence in the UK closed their UFO department completely on the grounds of lack of finance, which means, of course, now that although UFO files are available, they don't exist anymore, so they can't give them out. And this is what happens, I'm afraid. Now, following that other communication I just read to you, and the Master Aetherius spoke, and he said this: if your men in power were to have faith in God instead of a moth-eaten, wicked political system, if science were to have faith in metaphysics instead of the binding limitation of common mathematics, if an economic system were more interested in the world as a whole than it is in its own selfish interests — I think that's quite relevant at the moment, don't you? — we could then come among you freely, easily. We could then give to you safely our secrets of interplanetary and interstellar travel. Yes, interstellar. We could give to you our secrets of physical transportation by thought from any position upon the surface of your planet to any other position upon the surface of your planet. There are interesting accounts of ascended masters, bodhisattvas, who have claimed, and I believe some of those claims, to have travelled, to practice teleportation, both physically and out of body. One was a fascinating master by the name of Count Saint Germain. Have you come across that name? Actually, there are reports of him appearing not too far from here, at Mount Shasta some decades ago. But I actually went to a library near to Paris with my wife, who luckily is fluent in French, unlike me, and we were able to go to this library and see a document which we weren't really meant to see, but it's a long story, and we went. There's a place called Troyes, spelled Troyes, or it might be Troyes, I don't know, my pronunciation might be way out there. But anyway, we got there, we saw the document, and it's a fascinating document. And in fact, there's an excerpt of it in the book, which we translated there, because It's one of these historic documents. You have to wear white gloves when you touch it, and you aren't allowed to take it away or anything like that, of course. So we had to do it there. But in one instance, and the extract is in this book, it describes how Count Saint-Germain, and the description came from one of his closest followers by the name of Cagliostro, quite a well-known name, who he describes how Count Saint-Germain left Naples and travelled out of his body into space and saw various planetary bodies. And it's a beautiful, and this is an 18th century man, a fascinating man. That's a subject in itself, which is a little bit off the main theme tonight. But one of my favourite stories about Count Saint-Germain, he was well known at the courts of some of the Louis, especially Louis XV. And he would talk quite openly at these major banquets and so on about having lived for many thousands of years and so on. And he would tell these fascinating stories. He also negotiated for peace. He did many, many things at The Hague and so on. But he was recounting a story over dinner to someone, and he called his manservant over, and he said, what was the name of that person? In this incident he was describing from, I think it was from Egypt in the past. And the manservant said, I don't know, sire. I've only been in your service for 500 years. And this is recorded, by the way, in French documentation, in historical sources. Most of them are in French. And luckily my wife is a collector, and we have a lot of these fascinating stories which are quite authentic, and it's unusual descriptions of an ascended master and some of the things that he did not so long ago, and in the West, which is unusual too. Anyway, I've digressed there quite a bit. But that's because of the statement I just read to you about we could give to you our secrets of physical transportation by thought from any position upon the surface of your planet to any other position upon the surface of your planet. We could allow you then to visit our planets, to travel for yourselves through the solar system in the vehicles you call flying saucers. We could safely make these revelations to you, but it is a big if, isn't it? And it is, I'm afraid. You only have to look at the world the way it is. I'd just like to give you one more extract, if I may, and this was again the Master Theorius in 1957, and this is a beautiful extract, I feel, and it's this. You know, the shortest journey that you can make takes you the longest time to complete. That, dear friends, is the journey within you. If you go deep within your hearts, deep within your own minds, deep within your own intuition, and bring forth the treasures as you find them into the world outside, then, dear friends, can you illustrate to yourselves that you are really angels in disguise. Beautiful, isn't it? Absolutely beautiful words. And I know you'll love it. My personal favourite book in the world is this book, The Nine Freedoms. And I'm going to play you an extract from that in a moment. We're celebrating the 50th year of that book at the moment, and I'm also running an event inspired by it in Los Angeles on Sunday, which Paul Nugent, one of our directors, will tell you about in a moment, more about what's going on at the Aetherius Society in Los Angeles. But there's another book, The 12 Blessings, which is apart from anything else, it's beautiful poetry, apart from the wonderful content. So they're very varied. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there is the sort of more scientific information, particularly on the nuclear theme. And Dr. King in the 1950s was getting messages about aspects of the... I'll give you an example. There's an area in the UK called Sellafield. It's quite well known there because the incidence of leukemia is many times the national average. I think it's 10 or 20 times the national average. Dr. King was warning about that 10 days after the accident happened there in 1957, and told the Prime Minister, or communicated through various offices, and I think every member of Parliament at the time, which was completely ignored. He got information about the genetic effects of radiation and so on, way back then in the 50s, when people thought it was completely safe, officially governments and so on. And so it's very wide and very varied, and essentially it's a very practical program of action. We are directly cooperating now with beings from other worlds to try and help the planet. And it's that cooperation that enables them to do more too, because that was also an aspect of karma. But I think at this point, before I play the extract, it'd be rather good if Paul Nugent, if you'd kindly come fourth, or fifth? Fourth. Okay, and perhaps you'd like to just say a few words before I close with the extract, and then happily take any questions any of you may have. So, Paul Nugent, an International Director at the American headquarters of the Aetherius Society.
Thank you very much, Richard. What we're actually going to do in that little short conversation is we're going to play a DVD extract from the BBC in May of 1959. This was live television in a program called Lifeline, where Dr. King is being interviewed about his claims of being in contact with extraterrestrial intelligences, and the person who is doing the interviewing is a psychiatrist?
Yes.
He's being interviewed by a psychiatrist. I think the program overall is 30 minutes. Well, we're not playing the whole thing. This clip is about 6 or 7 minutes. But what you will see is Dr. King going into this, what we call a yogic samadhic trance, so that he can be used as a medium, as a channel for a cosmic intelligence, in this case a master we refer to as the Master Aetherius, to speak through him. And I'm sure you'll find it quite fascinating. This was live television, and here we go.
When the messages come to you as in your capacity that you've described as mental channel number 1, you go into trance and the voice speaks through you. Is that right?
Yes, the intelligence speaks through me. In other words, I gain a telepathic rapport with the intelligence from another planet, and he conveys his message through me.
Using your vocal cords?
Yes, oh yes.
Could you do that this evening?
I think I could, yes.
Now, who is going to speak through you this evening, if you can get in touch?
Intelligence from the planet Venus, who we call Aetherius.
Right. Will you now try to go into a trance for us?
I will try, yes.
Yes. Mr. King has explained to me that, in fact, it may take him 30 seconds, even perhaps as much as a minute, to get into a trance. And during this time, he has suggested that we should be entirely silent, and so we will be. We will wait for the voice if it comes through Mr. King.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My dear friend.
Your name is?
I am known as Aetherius.
Where do you come from?
The planet Venus.
Where are you speaking from now?
I'm sorry, my dear friend, I cannot answer that question for you.
I had wondered simply whether you were in a vehicle of some kind, a spaceship described by Mr. King when he was talking to me, or whether you were in your normal abode. But you can't tell me that?
No.
You do travel, normally, in what Mr. King has described as flying saucers when you move about space, do you?
Yes, that is quite correct. We have indeed been visiting this Earth of yours for some 18 million of your Earth years.
And when you come here, what is your purpose in coming?
At the moment, Earth, as you call it, faces a certain situation. The situation can be described as a rather a dangerous one. You are liable to upset the balance of your Earth through, number one, atomic experimentation, and number two, your deviation from the spiritual laws.
And your visits are designed to warn us against this?
Yes.
Can anybody see flying saucers when they arrive?
Oh, yes. The vehicles that you call flying saucers are quite physical. If you fired a 16-inch shell at the hull of a flying saucer, it would burst when it came into contact with the force screen or protective barrier around the vessel.
Is there one single message that you would like to give us this evening? I'm afraid it must be brief. You'll understand that.
Yes. I would like to say this. If you are a Christian, then live the laws as laid down by Jesus. If you are a Buddhist, live the laws as laid down by Buddha. If you are a Hindu, then be the best Hindu. This procedure is the one true way for men of earth to save themselves from their lower aspects.
Thank you, Aetherius, very much indeed.
Good night.
Good night.
So this is on the theme of service and the importance of service, and it's a typical aspect really of the kind of teaching that has been received. And I'd ask you, as you did then, very graciously, to listen with great respect and in silence for this 6-minute extract from The Third Freedom. Thank you.
Prepare yourselves, form the new world you would serve. Service is indeed a glorious undertaking. It is lasting, a form. Every act of service is written in lasting letters of fire in the Akashic book. When you walk into the halls of self-judgment, you will read what your own hand hath written upon these pages, and by the immutable law of karma, you will accordingly set limitation upon your rebirth. Break away from your own troubles by concentrating upon the sufferings of others. Serve in the great spiritual battle, and you can walk with head high and stand in any hall unafraid to read what be written there. The greatest yoga is service. The greatest religion is service. The greatest act is that act done in service. Kill possession, transmute selfishness into service for others, and your reward will come. Enlightenment, like the break of dawn upon the darkest night, will cast the shadows of this night before it. Serve, and you will become enlightened. Serve, and you will be practicing true selfless love. Serve, and the mighty power of Kundalini will rise in natural, unforced fashion and open the chakra jewels in your higher bodies. In will pour inspiration, and you will be standing on the verge of the initiation into adeptship. There are no words great enough to describe the wonder of service, and no words can describe the crime of selfishness. Know this: whether you like it or not does not matter. It is the truth. I, Mars, do declare it as such. If you believe it not, today, terrestrial man, you will know it in your morrow.
Thank you for listening with such attention and respect, which we do appreciate.
Please join Richard in the back. He has a variety of books, some CDs and such. Feel free to ask questions and visit with him, and we'll see you next week. If you enjoyed this meeting, please see our meetup site and give us a review, a positive review if you would, or if a negative review, then that too. And but come back and see us. Next month is Dr. Bruce Goldberg, and he'll be talking about time travel. So we'll see you next month. Thank you.